I never expected anyone to see me there. At the last table in the café, near the window, I sat as if not wanting to be noticed. But deep down, I longed to be recognized without having to say a word. It was my daily refuge, that invisible pause between the life I show and the life I feel. The world around me buzzed with noise and movement, but I allowed myself to stop, always with the same order, always with my hands wrapped around a warm mug, as if that quiet heat was the only thing keeping me from freezing inside. I watched people, read repeated passages from books I never finished, and let my mind wander through the faces passing by, until he started coming, always at the same time, with the same calm stride, eyes too bright to go unnoticed, and a demeanor that carried an old sadness but lived as if he'd learned to coexist with it. He never tried to talk to me, and maybe that's exactly why he caught my attention. There was something in his silence that spoke to mine, a kind of unspoken respect, a silent pact between two strangers who, without knowing it, recognized each other in their solitude, and even without exchanging a single word, I knew the exact moment he entered the café, because my body reacted. My breathing grew more restrained, my heart a little more alert, but I kept pretending I didn't see, and so did he, until the day our eyes met for too long to look away. Until the day, in an impulse I didn't even understand, I smiled. And in that small gesture, which lasted no longer than a breath, something in me surrendered, because that smile wasn't just kindness, it was permission, an opening, a seed. And in that silent moment between two gazes and a corner table, I knew, with a strange certainty, something had begun. After that smile, something shifted, not outwardly, but within me. There were no obvious gestures, no words exchanged, but the atmosphere between us had been touched, as if the silence, once comfortable and observant, was now filled with unspoken possibilities. I kept going to the café, sitting at the same table, with the same coffee in my hands, but I wasn't the same. I didn't know what he thought, if he thought anything, or if he'd interpreted my smile as politeness or an invitation. But just looking at him was enough to feel that something had moved. He started looking at me for longer. Sometimes he'd disguise it, sometimes he didn't. And I, without quite understanding why, felt my heart race when his eyes met mine. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Ridiculous and dangerous, because a smile, no matter how much it carries, is still just a smile. But there was tenderness in the way he watched me, a quiet care, and perhaps a hope. Our schedules began to align as if by coincidence or silent choice. He always sat 2 tables ahead of mine, with a book in hand and a cup of black coffee that cooled slowly, as if he too was more interested in the presence than the taste. Sometimes I noticed he marked pages he didn't read, and that made me smile inside. It's strange how we can build a shared routine with someone without ever hearing their voice. I started recognizing the small gestures, the way he propped, his elbow on the table when thinking, how he rubbed his chin when distracted, how he closed his eyes for a second before taking the first sip of coffee. And each of those gestures, no matter how subtle, kept me company. They brought me back to myself. Some afternoons, I thought about getting up, walking over to him, saying something silly like, "Do you come here often?" And I hated myself for that internal cliché. But I never did, because though my soul screamed for movement, my body still carried scars that made me hesitate. I didn't know what he carried or what he sought, but something in me said he too knew what it was to lose. Not literally, but the kind of loss that leaves you whole on the outside and hollow within. Maybe that's what connected us. The absence, the space we both filled in that café, each with our stories, our longings, our fears, and even without touching, I already felt there was something between us that couldn't be undone. I think there's a moment in every true connection when silence stops being a refuge and becomes a bridge, something between waiting and courage. I felt it on a cloudy Wednesday when he arrived before me. For the first time, he wasn't facing away or turned towards the window, but forward as if waiting, as if he knew I'd come. And I did. Even with a tight heart and uneven breath, I entered that cafe like every day, but with feet more aware of the ground. I walked to my usual table, and before I could look away, he lifted his eyes and saw me. Not as someone merely recognizing another, but as someone confirming something. And in that moment, just that moment, he smiled. A brief, discreet smile, but so full of presence that my chest opened as if it had been waiting for it far longer than I'd admitted. I sat down, slowly. I was trembling inside, but tried to keep my movements steady. When I looked up, he was still, there, eyes fixed on mine, unhurried, as if time had paused to give us this chance. He didn't get up. He didn't come to me, and for a reason I'd only understand later, that's what touched me most. He respected the space, let the gesture speak, and there, in that look that lasted long enough to be remembered, the silence between us gained a name. It was no longer absence. It was recognition. And then I smiled, for the second time. But now, with awareness, a smile full of everything, still unsaid, but already present between us. And when I smiled, he closed his book slowly, as if saying, "Now I can start another story." There was no conversation that day, no immediate approach, but there was something bigger than any words, an unspoken promise, an accepted spark. And when he left, a few minutes later, he gave me one last look before crossing the door. Not a goodbye, but a notice. He'd be back. And I had no doubt I'd be back too. Because in that cafe, at the last table by the window, between two tired strangers and a smile that finally found an answer, something serene, delicate, undeniable, had begun to bloom. The next day I arrived earlier, not out of anxiety, or maybe yes, but a new kind. The kind of anxiety that doesn't hurt, doesn't constrict. It just warms. The morning was cold, and the sky held that gray tone that makes the world seem quieter. I sat at my table, as always, and left my bag beside me, like someone marking territory without realizing it. Something in me vibrated silently, a small but intense expectation. Like waiting for a letter from someone who's never written, but you swear you feel. I was there not because I expected him to talk to me, but because deep down I knew the time for waiting was over. He came in shortly after, as always, calm with the same slow, steady steps. But this time, he didn't stop at his table. He stopped at mine and asked, with the softest, gentlest voice in the world, if he could sit. I nodded, unable to say a word. And suddenly, we were there, face to face, after so many days living, side by side, without touching. For a moment, it was like being inside a dream where nothing needs explaining. But then he smiled. That same discreet smile, but now more intimate, more alive. And he said his name, Oliver. And I repeated it as if tasting a new flavor. Sophie. We talked little in that first meeting, about the coffee, the cold, the book he said he carried more out of habit than interest. I laughed, and he noticed. The laughter seemed to put him at ease, and that for some reason moved me. He wasn't a man who imposed his presence. He was someone who asked for space with delicacy, and that kind of care was rare. Too rare. When it was time to leave, he stood first, said he enjoyed the conversation, and before going, he asked if I'd be back the next day. It was a simple question, but in its simplicity was everything. invitation, desire, and an almost shy care not to step an inch beyond what I was ready for. I said yes, and when he left, I realized my coffee had gone completely cold. I hadn't taken a single sip, but my heart, it seemed to have started thawing after a winter far too long. Over the days, sitting with Oliver became natural. There wasn't an exact moment when it became a habit. It just happened. And when it didn't happen, we missed it, even without needing to say so. He started arriving a few minutes after me, as if not wanting to pressure me with the punctuality of someone who expects too much. And I began noticing small rituals that emerged between us. He ordered black coffee, I ordered with milk. He always shared a piece of cake, and I accepted only after the second offer. We exchanged short stories, childhood memories, comments, about music, books, people who marked us and then vanished, and all without rush, without needing to fill every minute with words. The silence between us wasn't discomfort, it was acceptance. Little by little, things started spilling out of the cafe. A walk to the corner bookstore, a rainy day when we shared the same umbrella in silence. One time when he waited for me to leave work, just to walk me to the bus stop. None of it was planned. No let's make plans. Just gestures that sprang from a gentle desire to stay close, to build something without needing to name it. There was something in his eyes that pierced me with tenderness, not hurried desire, nor the kind of neediness disguised as passion. It was a calm curiosity, a genuine wish to know me, without invading, without shaping. And because of that, I started sharing things I hadn't told anyone in a long time. I talked about how I felt invisible inside, even when surrounded by people, about how I learned to protect myself with kindness and absences, about how I felt, strangely safe at the last table in the cafe, as if that place belonged to me more than my own home. And he just listened. Didn't interrupt, didn't suggest solutions. He was just there, fully present, and that was enough. One of those afternoons, he told me about losing his father, how it left him unmoored for a time, how he spent months going to the same cafe just because it was where he used to go with him on Saturday mornings. He said he didn't know if he was trying to remember or forget. And I understood. I understood with a depth that didn't come from words, but from what pain teaches us when we let ourselves feel it to the end. It was that day I realized what was growing between us wasn't passion. It was something rarer. It was care. He didn't come. On the first morning I waited, trying to pretend I wasn't waiting. I drank my entire coffee, read 3 pages of the book I carried just to seem distracted, and stayed there, staring at the door, with eyes that couldn't focus on anything else. When the bell at the entrance rang, my heart reacted, even if it was just a delivery guy, an old lady in a hurry, a couple arguing quietly. I tried to rationalize. Maybe he was sick, maybe traveling, maybe he just needed space. On the second day, the absence hurt deeper. The table in front of mine was empty, but it was as if it shouted his absence. The mug he always used stayed in the cupboard. The waiter gave me a quick glance, but didn't ask anything. Maybe out of respect, maybe because he too noticed that, though we weren't a couple, there was already something between us that didn't need explaining. On the third morning, I couldn't resist. I walked to his table where I'd never sat. I placed myself there, as if trying to understand the perspective of someone who'd left. And there, from that new angle, I realized how much he was already part of me, not through declarations, but through the way he listened, through the patience in our silences, through the presence without urgency. He gave me back to myself, little by little, without seeing me as broken. And maybe that's why his absence was so hard, because it was the first time in a long time that someone saw me without invading. It was 5 days. long enough for fear to grow, but too short to accept it was over. I didn't know if he'd come back. I had no phone number, address, social media, just that shared space in the cafe, which now felt vast without him. And it was one late afternoon, when I'd stopped expecting, that I heard that bell again, and my body knew before my eyes. It was him. Thinner, paler, but with the same gaze. He walked to my table, not his, and sat without asking. He took a deep breath before speaking. My brother. He had an accident. I had to go. I didn't know how to tell you, that was all, and it was enough. I reached my hand across the table and touched his. It was the first time we did that. A light touch, but one that said what even that prolonged silence couldn't erase. I'm here. He held my fingers with the same steadiness he held his own feelings, and then he smiled, tired but present. I smiled back, because what we had didn't need promises to continue, just truce. After he returned, everything seemed the same. But it wasn't. The cafe was still the same, the tables in the same places. The smell of fresh baked bread in the mornings still came like a good memory. But there was something different in the way he looked at me now, and above all, in the way I looked back. Before, there was hesitation, a subtle dance between closeness and distance, between wanting and fearing. Now there was space, a gentle acknowledgement that what was between us was real, maybe small to the world outside, but immense within us. We started seeing each other outside the cafe, without much planning, without labels, a walk in a nearby park, an afternoon browsing books in silence in the used bookstore section, an impromptu dinner with soup and bread and light laughter. It was simple, and it was so good to be simple. Being with him was like sitting by a fireplace after a long day. You don't need to talk much, just feel the warmth and know you're safe. Sometimes I thought about how this began, how a smile, a glance, and a table in the corner of a cafe opened space for so much, and I wondered how many stories are lost for fear of looking too long, for fear of being seen, and at the same time, of not being. Oliver talked more now. Not a lot, but with more depth. He shared stories about his brother, his childhood, the silences of the house where he grew up. There was pain in the subtext, but also strength. I listened and felt honored, because I know men like him don't speak easily, and when they do, it's because they trust. I too shared more about myself, about what I'd lost, about what I stopped feeling for fear of getting hurt, about how I'd grown used to seeming fine so as not to be a burden to anyone. And he looked at me as if every piece of me, even the broken ones, was still whole enough to be loved. We didn't talk about what we were. We didn't need to, not because we lacked courage, but because the love growing between us didn't depend on declarations. It was made of presence, of constancy, of a hand that appears after an absence and stays, of a shared coffee without words, of a silent afternoon without discomfort, and of a smile, still that one, that started everything, and that now happened, without warning, without ceremony, just because we were there, together. We started always sitting at the same table, that one in the corner where it all began. The difference now was that it wasn't my table anymore. It was ours. A space that once held silence and longing now held comfort and sharing. The people in the cafe started recognizing us together. A waiter or two already knew our orders, and sometimes even smiled before asking. We weren't a declared couple when we didn't need to be. But the way he touched his cup to mine when he wanted to make me smile, or how I adjusted the sleeve of his shirt with ease, said everything. It was curious to realize how discreet love can be and still change everything. Oliver asked me simple questions, but full of meaning. Did you sleep well? How was your day? Want to just sit in silence today? And those questions, said in a low, careful tone, gave me more security than any grand promise. I, who had grown used to being cautious with feelings, began to relax, to trust, not just in him, but in myself. I started looking at myself differently, smiling more without noticing, speaking more slowly, like someone no longer afraid to take up space. One afternoon, he took me to see the sea. It wasn't far, just a short drive to a calm, almost deserted beach. We walked barefoot on the sand, and there, with no one around, he held my hand firmly and said, "You gave me back a part of myself I thought was lost." I didn't know how to respond, because deep down, he'd done the same for me. On the way back, we were silent in the car, but it was a full silence, laden with meaning. I leaned my head against the window and smiled, and he, even while driving, reached out and held my hand for a moment. It was in that gesture that I understood what we were building. It wasn't a fairy tale, not an urgent story. It was real love, the kind that builds itself without you noticing, brick by brick, made of everything sincere, patient, and kind. And when we arrived at the cafe the next day, he waited for me at the door, not with flowers, not with a declaration, just with the look of someone who knows that from that moment on, wherever I am, he wants to be too. Life went on, as it always does. The days didn't change color, nor did the winds blow differently, because we were in love. But somehow everything in me was new. The mornings in the cafe continued, only now they began with the sound of our voices blending with 2 coffees on the table, and an intimacy that no longer needed to be earned, just cared for. Oliver started walking beside me like he'd always, or belonged there. There was something definitive in our silences, our soft laughter, our lingering looks that no longer needed to avoid anyone. There was no proposal to date, no formal talk about what we were. But one day, without thinking, he paid for our drinks and tucked his house keys into his back pocket. And when he walked me to my building's door, he asked if I wanted to sleep at his place that night. I said yes, with the same tone as someone answering if they want sugar in their coffee. And that's how we started sharing space, days, routines, without fanfare, without announcement, just a transition so natural it felt like it had been the plan all along. The first night I slept beside him, I woke to his calm breathing against my back. The world outside seemed distant, and I realized that for the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to run. I was exactly where I wanted to be. And when he, still half asleep, murmured my name in the dark and pulled me closer, everything in me settled. The last table in the cafe remained ours, not as a starting point, but as a witness to everything we built. We sat there in the late afternoons, even though our conversations now happened in his kitchen, on the couch, in the car, in the silence between the sheets. Sometimes I looked at that corner and remembered the day it all began with a smile. A gesture so small, so shy, and so full of truth. Today, when our eyes meet over the cups, we still smile. Not because everything is perfect, but because we know we chose each other. Because in the end, it was there, at that table, in that light, spontaneous gesture, that love won. Without promises, without guarantees, just with presence. And his smile, that first one, that I still carry inside me as the start of the most beautiful story I never thought I'd have the courage to live. Today, we sit together at the last table in the cafe, as always. But now it's not a refuge. It's a home. Not a home of walls, but of presence. He holds my hand with ease, like someone holding a good habit they don't want to lose. Sometimes, we don't even need to talk. The silence between us has learned to speak for itself. And when I smile, that same smile that started it all, he returns it with the same calm look, as if still surprised we're here. And so am I. because the love we built didn't come like a hurricane. It came like a breeze, like routine, like something that grows inside until one day you realize you're no longer alone. He saw me before he knew me. I felt him before I heard him. And when love won, in that moment with a simple smile, everything began. And it never stopped.